Welcome back to our AZ-104 exam prep deep dive. We're tackling implement and manage virtual networking in this episode, part 4 of this series. And you're going to want to ace these networking questions, not just for the exam,
Oh, we're absolutely
but because
sure.
it's the core of AMY cloud setup.
Yeah, think of it like this.
Uh-huh.
You can have the fanciest sports car in the world, but if it's stuck in a garage with no roads, what good is it?
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So Azure Networking is our highway system to get those high-performance apps moving.
Exactly. And just like any good highway system, we need to start with a solid blueprint.
Okay.
We'll follow the Implement and Manage Virtual Networking section of the Microsoft Study Guide, so you're right on track for the exam.
Sounds like a plan. So before we even think about spinning up a VM, what are the foundational elements we need in Azure?
First, remember those subscriptions and resource groups. They're not just administrative boxes you check.
Right?
Think of your subscription as your Azure account, and resource groups are like, organizing your tools in a workshop.
Right. You don't want to be hunting for that one specific wrench when you need it.
Exactly. Then we have naming conventions and regions.
Mhm.
Now, a poorly named resource might not seem like a big deal,
Right.
but imagine trying to troubleshoot an issue when everything is randomly named.
Chaos.
Yeah.
I can see how they would make things difficult.
And don't underestimate regions. Latency matters. You want your resources as close to your users as possible for optimal performance.
Okay.
The exam might throw you a scenario where a company has users in Europe. You'd need to know to pick a European region for their resources.
Okay, regions, check. But what about when things go wrong? Hardware can fail, right?
That's where high availability comes in, and the exam loves this stuff.
Okay.
You'll need to know the difference between availability sets and availability zones.
Okay.
An availability set is like having backup generators.
Okay.
If one fails, you've got others to keep the lights on.
Okay, that makes sense, but availability zones sound even more robust.
They are. Think of them as separate data centers within a region, geographically isolated. It's like having a backup data center in a different city.
Right.
Even if one entire data center goes down, your application can keep chugging along.
Wow, that's some next-level redundancy. So for the exam, should we expect questions on when to use one over the other?
Definitely. The exam tests your ability to choose the right solution, not just a solution.
Right.
An availability set might be enough for some applications, but for mission-critical systems, availability zones are the way to go.
Got it. High availability is key. Now, our VMs need a place to store all their data. What are our options there?
Azure offers different storage types: HDD, SSD, and standard SSD.
Okay.
Think of it like choosing between a bicycle, a car, and a sports car.
Okay.
HDD is your reliable workhorse. SSD is your high-performance machine, and standard SSD sits somewhere in between.
So HDD for simple tasks, SSD for speed demons, and standard SSD for a balance. Makes sense.
Right. But here's where the exam gets tricky.
Oh,
It's not enough to just know the options.
Right.
You need to know when to recommend each one.
ooh, good point. Give me an example question.
All right, imagine you're presented with a scenario where a customer needs to deploy a database server that requires high IOPS. Which storage type would you recommend?
High IOPS. That screams SSD to me. It's all about that speed and performance, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
See, you're getting the hang of this. Now, with storage sorted, let's actually create a virtual machine.
It's about time. Let's get our hands dirty.
Now, you don't need to memorize every single click for the exam.
Okay.
Focus on the why behind the choices.
Okay.
For instance, why might you choose a Windows VM over a Linux VM or vice versa?
Ooh, good question. I know Linux is open source and known for its flexibility, so maybe for web servers or applications where cost is a factor.
You're catching on quickly.
Okay.
Windows VMs are often the go-to for those .NET applications or anything tightly integrated with the Windows ecosystem.
Right.
The exam might describe a company's existing infrastructure and ask you to choose the most suitable VM type.
This is starting to feel less like rote memorization and more like strategic problem solving. I like it.
Exactly. And that's what being a good Azure administrator is all about. Now imagine this. Your application just got featured on a hugely popular website.
No.
Traffic is exploding. What do?
Panic. Call for backup. Tell everyone to refresh their browsers slowly.
Don't worry, Azure has a much more elegant solution. Virtual machine scale sets.
Scale sets.
Yeah.
Tell me more. Is that like automatically spinning up more VMs to handle the traffic surge?
You got it.
Wow.
Imagine having an army of VMs ready to jump into action when needed. That's the power of scale sets.
Okay, that sounds amazing. But are there situations where scale sets wouldn't be the right choice?
Excellent question. Not all applications are designed for horizontal scaling,
Yeah.
meaning they can't just be split across multiple instances and still work correctly.
Ah, that makes sense. It's not a magic fix-all solution. So how might this come up on the exam?
They might give you a scenario with an app that's having performance issues and ask you to choose the best solution.
Okay. You'll need to decide, is this a scale set situation or is something else going on? Always think critically.
This is really making me think strategically about Azure resources. It's not just about knowing what they are, but how they fit into the bigger picture.
Precisely. And that brings us to a crucial aspect. Security.
Right.
We can't just have these VMs out there without any protection, right?
Right. Data breaches are a nightmare. What does Azure offer to lock things down?
Azure Disk Encryption is your best friend here.
Okay.
Think of it as the Fort Knox of data protection.
Okay.
It ensures that even if someone gets their hands on your disks, they can't access the data without the encryption keys.
That's reassuring. But what about situations where a VM is acting up and you need to give it a fresh start? Is there a way to do that without losing everything?
You're thinking about redeploy. It's like hitting the reset button on your VM without losing any data on your disks.
Okay.
Imagine having to troubleshoot a misbehaving VM.
Right.
Redeploy lets you start fresh while keeping your data safe and sound. Okay, so we've covered creating VMs, handling traffic spikes, and even securing our data. We're on a roll. What other Azure networking magic awaits?
Let's talk automation. Time is precious, and no one wants to repeat the same tasks manually.
Right.
That's where ARM templates come in.
Okay.
Think of them as your infrastructure as code superheroes.
Ooh, infrastructure as code. That sounds powerful.
It is.
Okay.
With ARM templates, you define your entire infrastructure, VMs, networks, storage, you name it, in a simple, readable format.
So instead of clicking through the Azure portal a million times, we can automate the entire process.
Exactly. Less clicking, fewer errors, and it makes deployments repeatable and scalable.
Go.
You might get an exam question asking for the most efficient way to deploy a complex environment.
Right.
ARM templates are often the answer.
Okay, I'm sold on automation. But what about this whole world of containers and Kubernetes I keep hearing about? Is that something we need to master for the AZ-104?
Think of containers like lightweight VMs. They're perfect for packaging and deploying applications quickly and efficiently.
Okay, so kind of like a more streamlined VM approach.
Yeah.
What about Kubernetes? What's its role?
Kubernetes is the conductor of the container orchestra. It manages and scales those containers, ensuring they're running smoothly.
Okay.
For the AZ-104, you'll want a basic understanding of how containers and Kubernetes work in Azure. Think of it as adding another tool to your Azure toolkit.
Got it. Containers and Kubernetes, checked.
Mm.
Seems like we've covered a lot. Creating and managing VMs, scaling, security, even dipping our toes into automation and containers.
We have. But remember, this is just the beginning. We've only just scratched the surface of Azure Virtual Networking.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork, but now we need to unleash the full power of Azure networking.
Right.
What about those times when we need more than just basic connectivity between our VMs?
That's where we get into the really cool stuff. Let's talk about connecting your on-premises networks to Azure, building your own online empire with web apps,
Okay.
and mastering those networking tools that make it all happen.
This is where things get really interesting. Let's start with connecting our on-premises networks to Azure. What are our options there?
We've got two main players, VPN gateways and ExpressRoute. Think of them as two different ways to bridge your world with the Azure cloud.
Okay, so a VPN gateway is like that secure tunnel we all use to protect our internet traffic at a coffee shop,
Exactly.
but for our entire network.
It creates a secure connection between your on-premises network and your Azure virtual network, encrypting all the data that passes through.
So if a company wants to let their employees access Azure resources securely from anywhere, a VPN gateway is the way to go.
You got it. And the exam might ask you to choose the right VPN gateway type based on a company's needs.
Okay.
Do they need a basic connection for a small office or a high-performance gateway for a large enterprise? Each type has different bandwidth and connection limits, so you need to know the difference.
Okay, VPN gateways, check. What about ExpressRoute? When would you use that instead of a VPN?
ExpressRoute is like having a dedicated private highway straight to Azure. It bypasses the public internet entirely, giving you a faster, more reliable, and more secure connection.
So if a company is dealing with sensitive financial data or needs ultra-low latency for real-time applications, ExpressRoute is the answer.
Bingo. But ExpressRoute can be more complex to set up and manage than a VPN.
Okay,
It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
got it. For the exam, Should we expect scenarios where we have to compare VPN and ExpressRoute and choose the best option?
Absolutely. The exam loves to test your ability to choose the right tool for the job,
Right.
not just any tool.
Right.
Be prepared to justify your choice based on the specific requirements of the scenario.
This is making me think like a real Azure architect. We're not just learning features, we're learning how to apply them.
That's the key. Now let's move on to DNS.
Okay?
We all know websites use domain names,
Right.
but how does that work in Azure?
I'm guessing Azure has its own DNS service.
Mm-hmm.
That wouldn't surprise me at this point.
You're right. Azure DNS lets you host your domain names and manage your DNS records directly in Azure. No need to rely on a third-party provider if you don't want to.
Okay, so we can manage our DNS records, like pointing our domain name to our web server, all within Azure.
Exactly. And Azure DNS integrates with other Azure services, so it's super convenient.
That makes sense. For the exam, could we be asked to create a DNS zone or add records for a web server?
Absolutely. Be prepared for scenarios where you need to configure DNS for different types of Azure resources like virtual machines, load balancers, and even web apps.
Web apps. Speaking of which, let's talk about building our online empire with Azure web apps. This is where things get really exciting.
Web apps are a developer's dream.
Okay.
Imagine deploying your web application to Azure with just a few clicks. No need to worry about managing virtual machines or configuring web servers.
That sounds amazingly simple. Are there different types of web apps, or is it a one-size-fits-all service?
Azure offers different app service plans, each with its own set of features and pricing. You can choose a plan that fits your needs, whether you're building a simple personal website or a complex enterprise application.
So, for the exam, we'll need to know the different app service plans and when to recommend each one.
You got it. Pay attention to features like custom domains, deployment slots, or
Excellent.
scaling options. You might see a scenario where a developer needs to deploy a web app with a custom domain name and automatic scaling. You'd need to know which app service plan to recommend.
Okay, this is making a lot of sense. So we've got our web app up and running.
Right.
But what happens when it starts getting a lot of traffic?
Right.
How do we make sure it can handle the load?
That's where load balancers come in. Think of a load balancer like a traffic cop, directing incoming traffic to multiple servers to prevent any single server from getting overwhelmed.
Okay, so it's all about distributing the load and making sure our app stays responsive, even under pressure.
Exactly. Azure offers different types of load balancers, including internal load balancers for traffic within your virtual network, and external load balancers for traffic from the internet.
So for the exam, we might be asked to configure a load balancer for a specific scenario, like distributing traffic to multiple web servers.
You got it. Be prepared to choose the right load balancer type, configure load balancing rules, and even troubleshoot common load balancer issues.
Okay, load balancing. Mastered. What other networking tools should we have in our Azure toolkit?
We've covered a lot, but there are still a few essential tools to explore. Let's start with Network Watcher,
Okay.
your go-to for monitoring and diagnosing your network.
Network Watcher sounds like a powerful ally. What can it do for us?
It's packed with features like IP Flow Verify, which we discussed earlier.
Right.
It can help you track down network connectivity issues like a detective.
So if a user can't connect to a virtual machine, IP Flow Verify can help pinpoint where the connection is failing.
Exactly. Another useful feature is Connection Monitor, which continuously monitors the connectivity between two endpoints.
Okay.
Think of it as a heartbeat monitor for your network connections.
That's incredibly valuable. No more guessing games when it comes to network connectivity. For the exam, could we be asked to recommend a Network Watcher feature for a specific troubleshooting scenario?
Absolutely. Be prepared to explain when you'd use IP Flow Verify, Connection Monitor, or even Packet Capture, which lets you capture and analyze network traffic for deep dive troubleshooting.
Network Watcher, check. What other tools are there?
Another important tool is Azure Network Security Groups, or NSGs.
Okay.
They act like firewalls for your virtual network, allowing you to control traffic based on rules that you define.
So we can use NSGs to lock down our virtual network and only allow specific types of traffic, like web traffic on port 80.
You got it. NSGs give you granular control over your network security, and they're a critical part of protecting your Azure resources.
Okay, so for the exam, we might be asked to configure NSG rules to meet specific security requirements, like only allowing traffic from a certain IP address range.
Exactly. You might also need to troubleshoot NSG rules that are blocking legitimate traffic. This is where a strong understanding of ports, protocols, and IP address ranges comes in handy.
This is a lot to take in, but I'm starting to feel like I can build a pretty secure and robust Azure network. What other essential tools are we missing?
We've covered a lot, but one last important concept is virtual network peering.
Okay.
Imagine you have multiple virtual networks in Azure,
Okay.
and you need them to communicate with each other securely and efficiently.
Okay, so it's like building bridges between our different virtual networks.
Exactly. Virtual network peering lets you connect those networks together,
Okay.
allowing resources in one network to seamlessly access resources in the other.
That's super useful, especially for larger organizations with multiple Azure environments. For the exam, could we be asked to configure virtual network peering or troubleshoot connectivity issues related to peering?
You're absolutely right. The exam might present scenarios where you need to connect virtual networks across regions or subscriptions. So make sure you understand the ins and outs of virtual network peering.
Virtual network peering check. I'm feeling pretty confident about my Azure networking knowledge now, but before we wrap things up,
Sure.
there's one more big topic we need to tackle.
Right.
Troubleshooting.
Mm-hmm.
Because let's face it,
Yeah.
things don't always go according to plan in the world of technology.
You're absolutely right. Building a network is one thing, but knowing how to keep it running smoothly is crucial.
Right.
That's where your troubleshooting skills really come into play. And trust me, the AZ-104 exam will test your ability to diagnose and resolve network problems.
Okay, so what are some common network issues we might encounter in Azure, and what tools can we use to channel our inner IT detective?
Let's start with connectivity problems.
Hmm.
Imagine a user reports that they can't access a virtual machine.
Okay.
Your first step is to gather as much information as possible.
So ask them what they were trying to do, what error messages they saw, any recent changes they made.
Exactly.
Basically, get the lay of the land before diving into the technical stuff.
Once you have a clearer picture, you can start using tools like IP Flow Verify and Network Watcher.
Right.
We've talked about it before. It helps you trace the path of network traffic and see if anything is blocking it.
Right. It's like having X-ray vision for your network traffic.
Yes.
So if IP Flow Verify shows that a network security group rule is blocking the traffic, you know where to focus your troubleshooting efforts.
Precisely. But what if IP Flow Verify doesn't give you a clear answer? That's when you might try Connection Monitor, also part of Network Watcher.
Okay.
It continuously monitors the connectivity between two endpoints, so you can see if there are any intermittent issues or performance bottlenecks.
Connection Monitor, it's like having a heartbeat monitor for your network connections. Love it. But some problems are trickier, right? What if we need to go deeper?
For those really tough nuts to crack, we have Packet Capture.
Okay.
This lets you capture the raw network traffic going to or from a specific resource.
Wow, that's getting down to the nitty-gritty.
It is. Packet capture is like using a microscope to examine the individual packets of data flowing through your network.
Right.
You can analyze the headers, the payloads, the timing. It's a powerful tool for deep dive troubleshooting.
Okay, so we've covered connectivity problems. What about performance issues? Those can be tricky.
Absolutely. Imagine a user complains that an application is running slow.
Okay.
Your first instinct might be to blame the application itself.
Right.
But it could easily be a network issue.
So how do we pinpoint whether the network is the culprit?
Azure Monitor is your best friend here.
Okay.
It can show you metrics like network throughput, latency, and error rates.
Okay.
If you see high latency or low throughput,
Right.
that's a good indication that the network might be the bottleneck.
Azure Monitor is like having a dashboard for your network's health.
Yeah.
You can see at a glance what's going on and identify any potential red flags.
Exactly. And if you need even more granular insights into network performance,
Okay.
you can use Network Performance Monitor, another handy feature of Network Watcher.
Okay, so Azure Monitor and Network Performance Monitor are our go-to tools for diagnosing performance issues.
Right.
What other troubleshooting scenarios should we be prepared for on the exam?
DNS problems can be surprisingly common. If a VM can't resolve a domain name, it won't be able to connect to any resources that rely on that name.
It's like trying to call someone when you don't have their phone number. The connection just won't go through.
Perfect analogy. So if you suspect a DNS issue,
Okay.
start by checking the DNS settings on the affected VM.
Okay.
Make sure it's configured to use the correct DNS server and that the server is reachable.
And if the DNS server itself seems to be having problems, we'll need to do some digging to figure out why it's not resolving names correctly.
Exactly. Now, one last troubleshooting challenge that often comes up on the exam involves load balancers.
Okay.
Remember, these are crucial for distributing traffic and ensuring high availability for your applications.
Right. So if a load balancer isn't working correctly, it could lead to downtime or performance issues for our applications. How do we troubleshoot a misbehaving load balancer?
First, check the load balancer's configuration.
Okay.
Make sure it's configured with the correct backend pool, health probes, and load balancing rules.
So double check those settings and make sure everything's in order.
Exactly. If the configuration looks good,
Okay.
then you'll want to check the health of the backend servers themselves.
Okay.
The load balancer relies on health probes to determine which servers are up and running.
Right.
If a backend server is unhealthy, the load balancer will stop sending traffic to it, which could explain why you're seeing issues.
That makes perfect sense. It's like a restaurant with a full dining room, but only one chef in the kitchen. The orders are going to pile up, and the service will suffer.
Laughs. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So when troubleshooting load balancers, make sure those back-end servers are healthy and ready to handle the traffic.
Okay, I feel like we've covered a ton of ground today. From the core components of Azure Virtual Networking to those ninja-level troubleshooting techniques. I'm feeling much more confident about the AZ-104 exam now.
That's what we like to hear. Remember, the AZ-104 isn't just about memorizing facts.
Right.
It's about understanding how to apply those facts to real-world scenarios.
Right.
So keep practicing, keep experimenting, and keep that troubleshooting mindset sharp.
And to our listeners, we're here to help you succeed. Don't be afraid to reach out to the Azure community for support and guidance. We're all in this together.
Absolutely. The Azure community is incredibly welcoming and supportive. There's a wealth of knowledge out there, so don't hesitate to ask questions and learn from others' experiences.
Well, that brings us to the end of another deep dive. I hope you've enjoyed our journey through the world of Azure Virtual Networking. We've covered a lot of ground, but we've only scratched the surface of what's possible with Azure.
Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep building amazing things in the cloud. Until next time, happy networking.